afternoon, everyone. My name is Lorraine DeSerbo. I am a current board member for the Center for French Colonial Studies, and I am here to announce the last speaker for the day. No offense to you. Abigail G. Scott is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Kansas. Her dissertation, French Imperial Memory and the American West, 1760 to 1860, explores how France remembered its North American colonies during its conquest of Algeria. She currently works as a graduate assistant for the Western History Association. She received her master's in history and bachelor's in history and French from the University at Louisiana at Lafayette. Ms. Scott was the recipient of the Foundation's 2024 Educational Research Award and the 2023 recipient of the Center for French Colonial Studies Eckberg Scholarship. Last year, Abigail joined the board of the Center for French Colonial Studies as Le Consul. Please welcome Abigail Scott as she presents Delaunay's Transatlantic Lie, a French con artist in Missouri.
Can everybody hear me all right? Yes. Can the people in the back hear me? All right, now we can party. So first of all, I want to thank, all of you here. Normally when I present at conferences, I have maybe 5 people in the room. I think we might have more than 5 people here today. That's kind of awesome. Next, I want to thank Bob Mueller, Christy James for inviting me to speak today. I'm also very grateful for the Foundation for the Restoration of St. Genevieve and the Center for French Colonial Studies. And I love St. Genevieve. I always look forward to coming back, and I'm very excited to return in the future. So today I'm presenting a portion of my dissertation, and I've had a little bit of trouble writing this chapter, so I look forward to your questions and comments. And as Lorraine DeSerbo said, my dissertation examines the ways in which memory affects imperial expansion. And while this isn't directly related to St. Genevieve at first glance, I want to propose some avenues of research for you guys. So, we start this story in April 2025. I was studying in Toulouse in southwestern France. Just north of me, about 30 minutes by train, was a town called Montauban. If you're familiar with French history and art, Montauban is the hometown of artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, known for his portrait of Napoleon, up here, and the author Olympe de Gouges, her, who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. While Montauban holds some celebrity for its inhabitants during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic period, the town also shares another interesting claim to fame. It is the sister city with the town of Pawhuska, Oklahoma. Initially, there isn't anything noteworthy about this partnership. Sister cities are an agreement between 2 towns for the purpose of promoting cultural and commercial ties. But how did Montauban become a sister city to Pawhuska, the capital of the Osage Nation? Additionally, how is this small section of the Jardin des Plantes, located near the heart of Montauban, Native American-owned land? So I know this plaque is quite small, but if you read it, it essentially says, "You are standing on Osage land. Please be respectful and respect the tenureship and stewardship of Native peoples in the Americas and elsewhere." To answer these questions, we need to go nearly 200 years back in time. In 1785, 18-year-old David Delaunay of Bécherel-Brittany left France to serve in the English army in Saint-Domingue. Delaunay left France during the French Revolution, and according to a lawyer's testimony, he was friends with François-René de Chateaubriand, the famous author and French politician. Chateaubriand had fled to the United States during the French Revolution because of his noble background. And in French last names, de signifies nobility or former nobility. So, Delaunay might have left France because of his noble lineage as well. Yet, Delaunay's flight to Saint-Domingue did not mean he escaped the violence of the Revolutionary era. At the end of the 19th century, enslaved Haitians revolted against their French masters. And Saint-Domingue was a sugar colony and France's most lucrative colony in the Caribbean. Since Saint-Domingue had sugar plantations, other countries such as Great Britain and even the United States looked towards Saint-Domingue as a potential colony. And it is during this period that Delaunay entered Saint-Domingue. And we can surmise that Delaunay participated in the Haitian Revolution as a member of the English army. In 1805, France officially lost the colony of Saint-Domingue, and as a result, white settlers fled the island for the United States. While many of the French colonists and enslavers settled in southern states such as Louisiana and Alabama, or in metropolitan cities such as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, some of these Saint-Domingue refugees settled in Missouri. Some scholars estimate that roughly 10,000 Saint-Domingue refugees entered the United States per year. And in Louisiana, this influx of French settlers strengthened the region's Francophone culture. Here, in Sainte-Genevieve, we have Jacques Guibourg. Guibourg, however, left Saint-Domingue and went back to France before fleeing the French Revolution for the United States. It appears that Delaunay went straight to the United States, as a later French court case tried to determine his citizenship. Ultimately, this French judge ruled that Delaunay was an American citizen, not a French citizen, because he had been away from France for over 20 years by that point. Another way we can determine his American citizenship was that he had purchased land in the United States. Since Delaunay filed this land claim in 1800, it is implied that he left Saint-Domingue when Toussaint Louverture came into power, but before Napoleon Bonaparte dispatched troops to reclaim the island. When the United States sought to ratify the land claims during the French and Spanish periods of Louisiana, the Board of Land Claims Commissioners specified that Delaunay had immigrated from Missouri to the Missouri borderlands from Saint-Domingue, thus differentiating him from Guibourg. After arriving in the Missouri borderlands, Delaunay obtained at least 3 enslaved people, either in the United States or he had taken them from Saint-Domingue. The Versailles-born physician Antoine Saugrand, who lived in St. Louis, noted in his ledgers how he had provided Delaunay with medication for an enslaved woman named Julie and another person named Angélique. After arriving in the U.S., Delaunay then entered the fur industry. Fur merchants tended to view indigenous peoples as a buffer to slavery's expansion. A petition to the United States Congress, dated February 1, 1806, expressed the concerns of Missouri's inhabitants about the American land grants and the cultivation of land. According to the petition, Louisiana's French and Spanish government had granted them the land for the defensive purposes against the nearby Native American communities. But these lands were also desirable for timber, agriculture, and mining industries. And despite these 3 industries, the petitioners attributed the lack of plantations in the St. Louis region to the indigenous nations, either due to threats of violence or their inability to seize the nearby land. Yet, it was mainly the French who worked within the fur industry, and these French merchants acted as middle management or negotiable instruments of American expansionism. And Delaunay's name appeared in multiple court dockets alongside the upper echelons, some of those court documents right there, of St. Louis's fur industry, such as Bernard Pratt, Pierre Chouteau, Edward Hempstead, Jean-Pierre Cabane, and John Malamphy. The appearance of Delaunay's name in these records reflected his participation within the Chouteau family's extensive network throughout the Trans-Mississippi West. As historian Jay Gitlin demonstrated, these French traders diversified their incomes, and the Missouri borderlands existed as a bourgeois frontier, which is what Gitlin termed this area, instead of the imagined entrepot. Delaunay was no exception to this practice, as in 1806, he became the Justice of the Common Pleas, the General Quarter Sessions for St. Louis, and the Adjutant General of the Arkansas Territory. Indeed, Delaunay had a successful time in 1806, as Pierre Chouteau left him and Auguste Chouteau in charge of the Pierre Chouteau Jr. and Company during his absence. And French merchants diversified their incomes because of the trade's instability and debt system. the fur trade declined in profitability between 1806 and 1805 as it, quote, gradually became an Indian business with the government money supplanting furs in importance, end quote. Additionally, after Napoleon's exile in 1815, French merchants in the western United States were in a weak position for commercial expansionism. European markets had high demands for furs, yet following 1815, Europe's instability, as well as the changed landscape of the Great Lakes region, where many of these fur-bearing animals resided, signaled changes for the fur market. Additionally, fashion tastes changed and continued to shift away from furs. And as a result, these French merchants diversified their profits to secure their own survivance in this area. And this diversification was not always successful. On February 27, 1815, Delaunay petitioned the United States government for compensation for his services as Adjutant General of Missouri's militia in the War of 1812. In the 1820s, Delaunay and his wife Eleanor increasingly appeared before the St. Louis court for foreclosures. Finally, in 1824, Michel Tesson filed for Delaunay to appear in the St. Louis Circuit Court for a mortgage. And it could be inferred that during this period, Delaunay contacted Tesson's brother, Francois, a future collaborator. These court documents portray Delaunay as a man in financial straits. Similarly, the fur trade stopped being as profitable. Taking notes from his former employers and co-workers, the Chouteau family, Delaunay decided to exploit his relationship with the Osage people. At some point, Delaunay contacted the Little Osage and their interpreter Paul Lois with the opportunity of visiting France. However, prior to leaving for France, the Osage people signed the 1825 treaty with the United States, which forced them to move westward, but I'll discuss that a little bit later. French merchants got involved and profited from this Indian removal. Auguste Pierre Chouteau signed the Osage Treaty of 1825 to absolve any debts that he had acquired as a merchant, but also to claim land from the Osage people. And the Osage Treaty of 1825 marked the first time for this practice. And by 1831, French profiteering from native dispossession had become commonplace. Again, J. Gentlin demonstrated how these French merchants were bourgeois in their ability to work in real estate. But real quick, I will detour to discuss Paul Lois. Lois was the son of a Frenchman and an Osage woman. In 1805, Lois worked as an interpreter among the Kaw and Osage people. Yet despite being central to the communication during the Osage voyage in France, Lois remained relatively undocumented. He only appeared in reports when he had intervened as a translator, or more surprisingly, during his return to the United States from France, to have been revealed that he was traveling with his son the entire time. I do want to note that some U.S. officials, such as H. Simmons in the accountant's office at St. Louis, distrusted Lois's translations. And there's also a potential that Lois worked for his own personal interest. In other Native communities, such as the Cherokee and Muskogee, these Métis men claimed positions of relationship. And records from the Department of War reported that Lois, alongside Delaunay, had accrued debts from their involvement with the fur trade. And Lois did not adequately receive compensation as he continued to submit additional receipts for his services. And I raise this issue for us to consider the nuance and complexity of the fur trade, kinship, and motivations for leaving the United States. So on the thing, I have highlighted a few of the people who traveled to France, but more interestingly, this painting over here is of an Osage warrior. We believe it is Little Chief, who was the leader of the Little Osage, but it is actually painted by a woman, Anne Marguerite Hyde de Neuville, who was the wife of the French ambassador to the United States, Hyde de Neuville. And Anne Marguerite actually somehow acquired a map of the Black Hills from Sioux-speaking people, like the Sioux Nation, and she brought it to France, left it to her niece, and it's now within the French National Archives, which is another thing that I'm kind of digging into because it's just very strange as to why French people are acquiring native documents and then leaving it to their children, more or less. So following the Osage Treaty of 1825, the Osage people found themselves in a difficult situation. Starting in 1808, members of the Cherokee Nation moved westward into modern-day Arkansas to hunt. And some Cherokee even went further west to trade horses with the Pawnee and the Comanche. And while this initial wave of Cherokee immigration did not affect the Osage Nation much, in following years, tensions over hunting, trade, and ammunition escalated between the two groups. And by the 1810s, the Cherokee and Osage were at war. The United States intervened in 1816 and 1818 with two treaties. And these treaties meant to alleviate the conflicts between the Cherokee and the Osage. Unfortunately, these treaties included clauses that stole Osage land for these Cherokee immigrants. As a result, as the historian Kathleen Duval wrote, quote, the United States officials interpreted the treaties as Osage capitulation to the plan of filling Louisiana with Indian refugees, end quote. So by the 1820s, the Osage had lost their influence in the mid-continent to the immigrant Cherokee. So when Delaunay approached the Osage, or vice versa, both he and the Osage were in difficult positions, as both parties had suffered financial and personal losses. It is important to note that the information about this event comes from second-hand witnesses. The first document I found with Delaunay's signature was here in St. Genevieve at the library. I, like Rebecca, nearly screamed, and it kind of scared the librarians at how excited I was. While I have yet to find a document written by him, if you happen to have any documents hiding in your attic, please let me know. I do know that Delaunay had dabbled in some trade here. More importantly, all the information about the Osage people came from these European sources. For example, Delaunay attested that the Osage had originally approached him with the intention of going to France. And to pay for this voyage, the Osage hunted animals, sold their meat and furs, and then saved those earnings. On their way to St. Louis, their boat had capsized, thus losing a considerable proportion of their haul. As a result, the initial group of 25 people downsized to just 6. Kihegashuga, Little Chief, Nyahanga, Sacred Son, Gremotin, Hawk Woman, Marchanchuta, Big Soldier, Washing Saba, Black Spirit, and Minkchahatu, Little Soldier. From St. Louis, the group comprised of Delaunay, the 6 Osage, Lois, and Francois Tesson departed for New Orleans. In New Orleans, the group boarded the ship the New England for Le Havre, France. At Le Havre, the local townsfolk rushed to the docks for a glimpse of the Osage people. Father Andrews, who had seen the group in New Orleans before his departure to France, had published a letter a few weeks earlier announcing the arrival of the Osage. Between this letter and the genuine curiosity, the French crowd stormed the part of Le Havre, and due to the folly, French troops had to escort the Osage from their ship to the carriage. And once in France, the Osage dined with local elites and attended operas. French spectators could not get enough of the Osage. During one of the operas, the Osage left during the intermission because the other attendees would not stop crowding and trying to touch them. Chateaubriand and James Fenimore Cooper had popularized the notion of banishing Indians, so the French viewed them as the last of the Osage, the hit in France at the time. French attempts to touch and stalk the Osage stemmed from their romantic belief and obsession that Native Americans were a disappearing people. And this belief frustrated the Osage because they could not travel peacefully. And as a result, Delaunay and the 6 Osage left Le Havre for Rouen before continuing to Paris. They arrived in Paris on August 13, 1827, where they stayed at the Hôtel de la Terrasse en Rue de Rivoli. 6 days later, they breakfasted with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and 40 guests. A few more days later, on August 21st, the 6 Osage met with the Bourbon King Charles X at his residence in St. Cloud. During this meeting, Charles X declared, quote, that the Osage had always been faithful to France while their country had been under his rule, and that he hoped the Osage would be equally faithful allies to the United States, end quote. During the Jacksonian era of the United States, President Andrew Jackson had placed increasing pressure on France with tariffs. Sounds a little bit familiar. Jackson knew about the Osage in France because he had addressed a letter to Martin Van Buren to learn more about this French Delaunay character. And King Charles X probably meant for this remark to serve as a bandage for Franco-American relations, especially since the United States had become more aggressive in dispossessing the Osage of their lands a few years prior. Yet, the European spectator opted to ignore the realities of native modernity, assimilation, and adaptation. For the rest of that month, a judiciary newspaper included the Osage's whereabouts for theater-goers to see them. On August 29, 1827, Little Chief gave a toast to the Parisian opera crowd. According to the article, the audience then gave a greater ovation to him than the actual performers. The anonymous author expressed his disbelief that, quote, the residents of the shores of the Missouri, end quote, had similar taste to that of the French spectators. Yet the Chouteaux had kinship and economic ties with the Osage nation. They had imported the fineries of France's cultural sphere into the Trans-Mississippi region. Thus, the Osage and other indigenous communities had previously encountered these dances and balls. And this remark ultimately showed the lack of French knowledge about Missouri's cultural and francophone landscape. French authors littered references to the grandeur of France's North American colonial empire throughout texts, especially in Paul Vicier's works. In Vicier's Six Indiens Rouges, which went through 3 editions in 3 years, which if you read it, the first edition gives you an overview of like who the Osage are, and the later editions tell you who the Osage are, but what they have done and eaten and seen while they have been in France. But according to Vicier, the Osage, quote, professed the highest degree of admiration to the French nation, of which its military glory rang in their ears, end quote. And after hearing about his great-grandfather's visit to France in 1725, Little Chief exclaimed, quote, and I, too, I will visit France if the Master of Life permits me to become a man, end quote. In this declaration, Vicier and the French readers exploited native memories of France's colonial past, and this presentation of Little Chief's recollection omitted the reality that Etienne de Bourmont, a négociant or businessman for the West Indies Company, took those native people from this region to France as an advertisement for additional investment in the company. And this exploitation as advertisement persisted as French theaters performed adaptations of Chateaubriand's Les Natchez, created one-off plays about the Missourians, or published musical pieces about Osage nationalism. French memories of its colonies and former allies formed discursive practices of national belonging. Vicier wrote his books with the aid of Delaunay and Tesson, and during a period of intense censorship. France no longer controlled the territory in North America, yet somehow the empire managed to stay favorable to the Osage people. They wanted to portray the Osage as French fanatics because an indigenous love for France translated to a French love for the Osage people. And Vicier propped up French power by articulating the prowess of France's indigenous allies in North America. This native strength seemed to Vicier and the French readership to bolster France through a notion such as birds of a feather flock together. French historian Jennifer Sessions, despite writing about Algeria, described colonialism as a cultural practice to legitimize the political regime. Similarly, in Tony Schaefer and Amanda Seker's Promoting the Colonial Ideal, France's empires throughout the 19th and 20th centuries were not stable entities. Indeed, imperial power, quote, fostered the same sense of belonging to France and pride in its achievements, end quote. By layering positive memories onto the Osage people, French authors wrote a narrative of French nationalism and pride. Even if the Osage decided to willingly travel to France, as described by Vicier and Delaunay, the positive portrayal of their arrival worked as a propaganda tool for the Bourbon Restoration, a controversial regime in post-revolutionary France. While the Bourbon Restoration was a divisive regime, French literature all agreed on the need to embrace the civilizing mission. French authors agreed that the spread of civilization and modernity, both terms being equally ambiguous in this period, were central to the French imperial project. As a result, political ideologies wielded the Osage people and their memories as a tool for French expansionism. In A Parisian Letter to Kihei-Gashua, Prince of the Osage tribe, the author lamented the fact that the Osage were visiting France during a tumultuous period. Yet despite France's political turmoil, the author urged that the Osage profit from the French theater as it was the best in the world. Another letter in La Fête du Christianisme remarked that notices about the Osage contained mistakes. This author, who goes by AC, accused the journal's editor of reinforcing the stereotypes of the Osage nation's degraded state. And AC argued that the Osage had a good education system and faculties based upon methodology and reasoning. As he wrote, quote, "It is only natural to humanize tribes of savage people. It proves that everyday religion is just as political savvy as it is morally just," end quote. Yet the civilizing mission relied on the efforts, or lack of efforts, from imperial agents, here being David Delaunay. Throughout France's imperial history, the nation-state blamed the failures of the civilizing mission upon its agents, and not the empire itself. On October 26, 1827, the police arrested Delaunay for unpaid debts worth 9,385 francs. Louise Freya-Borloo, veuve de Marchilhac, filed the complaint about this debt, even though Delaunay and Monsieur de Marchilhac had canceled the debt back in June of 1799. And while the Paris Tribunal newspaper followed the case, the court reporters remarked on their desire and belief that the 6 Osage people would appear in court to testify on Delaunay's behalf. They never appeared. Instead, French opinion shifted. Delaunay was released from prison Saint-Pélagie a few days later on November 1st. However, the next day's newspaper reported about an incident in Corbeil, a small town in the Marne department. Apparently, the Osage and Paul Lois drank a wine punch in the Corbeil Theater's cafe. Some locals drank beer nearby, to which Lois approached them and asked why they had their backs to the Osage chief. Lois then grabbed the villager, cried that he would demolish him, before Big Soldier cried for his Osage compatriots to eat the man. If they have a translator, how did they know that that's what he said? Very interesting. Without adequate sources, this story could be completely fabricated. French audiences had expectations for Native people and their actions. In the French imagination and cartography, indigenous people were overwhelmingly cannibals. And while Big Soldier may have threatened these villagers, he probably didn't want to eat them. Yet, the news report overlaid racist assumptions onto him and his actions. And as a result, this article presented the 6 Osage and Lois as more animalistic and dangerous without Delaunay's presence. By the middle of November 1827, French newspapers published advertisements for balls to raise funds for the Osage. Rhetoric had moved away from former tales of exoticism to proclamations of pity. The author of this article remarked that perhaps the Osage wanted to implement French balls on the shores of the Missouri River. This comment ignored the fact that the French inhabitants and French Canadians had already transplanted French balls and culture into the upper Louisiana region. However, the author wrote that the Osage could not transplant these values of French civilization to Missouri unless a benefactor stepped forward to help them return to their homelands. The publication of this article revealed that Europeans had frequently discussed the plights and horrors of their captivity in Europe. Things would continue to worsen. In early 1828, Delaunay sued the lead editor of La Sentinelle for libel. He received 300 florins, while the editor was imprisoned for 6 weeks. At the same time, the Osage wanted to return home, yet Delaunay refused to let them leave. His tour of Europe resulted in more economic hardships, as Delaunay had previously filed for multiple bankruptcies in Missouri and his refusal to let the Osage escape, as Le Moniteur Universel reported, coincided with Delaunay's desire to continue to wring money from the Osage obsession. Yet, this obsession also turned towards deviancy. In August 1828, Gargan, a stableman, appeared before an elderly sailor, Monsieur Leroy, and stated that he had returned to France from Osage country. The two men then went to a brothel, I guess as men do, before Gargan robbed Leroy of 200 francs. The French courts excused Gargan for the crime, yet whoever robbed Leroy purposely used the Osage as an alluring and exotic charm. Similarly, French newspapers ran stories exclusively about European revelers playing Osage during the carnival season. Potentially to escape this negative attention and to reach new audiences, Delaunay took the Osage out of France. So this is just one of those little articles that just says, Delaunay's been released from prison, he's gone back to his Osage. They're so excited, but again, how do we know? This is also another drawing of the 6 Osage while in France. So after leaving France, while in Liège, Belgium, Sacred Son gave birth to twins. A wealthy Walloon woman managed to wrench one of these babies away for adoption. According to the enslavement records at the National Archives in France, in 1762, indigenous children were kidnapped to French cities such as Paris, Versailles, and Poitiers to learn a trade. As seen in works about the Black Atlantic, craftsmanship and education in the metropole signaled the hallmarks of European beliefs about civilization. Indeed, even the Marquis de Lafayette transported an Oneida boy, Peter Otisquet, to France for his education and improvement. Or, as I learned earlier this year from Emily Lyons, Lafayette met with Mary, an Oneida woman at Kaskaskia. This Walloon woman probably took Sacred Son's child to instruct her about European civilization. And many of these enslavement records repeated the theme of acculturation and education for the betterment of Native children. And these records create even more questions about indigenous experiences in Europe away from the exploitative performances. In 1829, the horrors persisted as Delaunay abandoned the Osage in Germany. After Delaunay's abandonment, as Le Figaro wrote, these, quote, children of the New World could not find their subsistence for each day, end quote. And Delaunay, who had once introduced the Osage to princes, but now the 6 Osage sleep in the streets. In Munich, the Osage starved. Le Figaro did not attribute this horror to the French or European apathy, as the theaters had previously welcomed and fed them, but to Delaunay, who was the sole cause of this disaster due to his lawsuits. As the newspaper asked, did the reader want Sacred Son to become Maratone, the maid from the Asturian hotel in Don Quixote, or for Little Chief to work as a valet? Who should be more pitied? The Osage who serves the European, or the European who is being served by the Osage? End quote. The author mused about how other indigenous Americans would respond to the events that befell the Osage. Yet, he was more concerned about France's reputation and this notion of French benevolence that existed in North America. The Cherokee newspaper, Cherokee Phoenix, had reported on the Osage movement throughout Europe, thus demonstrating an indigenous cosmopolitanism. Additionally, it highlighted Le Figaro's fears about how other indigenous communities in North America may view the treatment of the Osage in Europe. In June of 1829, the Osage returned to France after traveling through Germany, Switzerland, and Prussia. At some point during their return, the 6 Osage got separated into 2 groups of 3. One group headed north toward Le Havre, their initial arrival port, and the other group traveled south toward Bordeaux. Additionally, Paul Loyce had been present throughout the whole ordeal, yet he remained missing from the overall narrative. In letters with the Minister of the Interior, Isaac Cox Barnett, accused Loyce of exploiting his Osage compatriots, despite being half Osage himself. And after receiving funds from the Parisian citizens, including the Marquis de Lafayette, Barnett and the French secretary to the Minister of the State, Delaunay, coordinated the northern group of Osage's return to New Orleans via New Orleans. Yet, however, before they could depart, the French government seized their goods to pay for Delaunay's debts. The southern group ended up in Montauban and the Tarn-et-Garonne department. There, the Bishop of Montauban, Louis-Guillaume Dubourg, and the town raised funds for the Osage's return. Dubourg had recently arrived in Montauban after leaving his position as the Bishop of Louisiana and the two Floridas in St. Louis, Missouri. Indeed, the arrival of Hawkwoman, Little Chief, and Big Soldier in Montauban demonstrated Osage knowledge and connections within France. Dubourg had previously baptized Osage people in St. Louis. Therefore, their meeting in Montauban had not been a coincidence. While newspapers in Europe and North America presented the Osage as destitute, here they used their connections from Missouri to secure their survival and return. After the Osage returned to North America, the obsession remained ever present in France. French authors transformed the Osage people from a group of exploited people into satirical metaphors about French society. In an article titled Moeurs Parisiennes, G.R. denounced the Parisian budget cuts by invoking the Osage people. As he wrote, quote, "But the budget! An entire tribe of Osage would leave Missouri to come and camp on the square of the Palais Bourbon. Their presence would not make us forget an amendment or suppress a speech," end quote. And by invoking the Osage, G.R. compared the civility of the two nations. Could France supersede its political and budget issues, or would it be like French perceptions of Native communities in the Americas, fractured and not working? Overwhelmingly, French discourse supported the colonial cause, yet anti-colonial sentiments existed. In the 1829 issue of Le Silhouette, Victor Ratier published a lithograph entitled The Return, or The French in Missouri. An article from a Chiriquois journal accompanied the lithograph. An Osage scholar from the shores of the Trinity River became increasingly interested in the customs and practices of foreign people. To satiate his intellectual cravings, he sought out, quote, ancient people from the French nation, end quote. In the Kansas Plains, he presented his French spectacle, and the French spectacles exemplified the four categories: the soldier, the gentlewoman, the romantic, and the classic. And according to this imaginary Osage scholar, the romantic and the classic were politically at odds because they were rivals on all fronts. In this political cartoon, an article mocked the exploitation of the Osage, Sarah Bartman, a South African woman in France at this time, and the eventual exploitation of Iowa performers by George Catlin. And normally these performances were put under a guise of education or erotic projection. Yet, this story does not end in the 19th century. In 1987, a teacher in La Française near Montauban read a curious article in Historama about the Osage abduction to France. This teacher, Jean-Claude Tourlet, this little old man right here, wanted to know more, so he sent a letter with a copy of this article to the mayor's office in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. After some trouble deciphering this letter, my favorite is they told me that a woman by the name of Angela Robinson just happened to have a English-French dictionary in her house, so she just painstakingly looked up every single word to translate this very weird letter. The Osage reached out to Drolet, and they created the Association Oklahoma Occitan. The Association Oklahoma Occitan commemorates the shared struggle of marginalized racial and linguistic groups in the American and French empires. Throughout the 19th century, France suppressed minority languages such as Occitan to dissolve regional identities in favor of a standardized French nation-state. Today, the Association Oklahoma Occitan defines its goals as the preservation of Occitan culture, but also to maintain kinship with the Osage Nation and other indigenous American communities. Currently, I am working with the Association Oklahoma Occitan to commemorate the bicentennial of the abduction of Little Chief, Black Spirit, Big Soldier, Little Soldier, Hawk Woman, and Sacred Son of France. And as a result, this presentation is simply a small part in a larger living project. And these images depict on the PowerPoint the dedication and donation of land in Montalban to the Osage Nation of Oklahoma. This little text box right here says, "Attention, do not walk on this land. It is sacred and ancient." And these are also like Jim Gray is the chief of the Osage Nation. And here's Jim Gray again. I also just think it's really charming. I think all these groups should just have like a cartoonist in the corner drawing So when y'all do y'all's Spectres thing in October, I really hope there's a cartoonist drawing all the interactions. That'd be a lot of fun. So finally, how does this project tie to St. Genevieve? My dissertation examines historical memory and commemorations. St. Genevieve is a great community to analyze these souvenirs, physical and intangible. What stories are we telling? Who are we centering? How does St. Genevieve connect to the greater Francophone world? While written in French, Soisic, or Tanguy Villarbou, wrote a great article about the Egyptian valise belonging to François Vallée. Additionally, I came across published letters from anonymous inhabitants in St. Genevieve, published in the Philadelphia newspaper L'Abeille Américaine. St. Genevieve fits neatly into J. Gitlin's bourgeois frontier, and these homes and buildings were centers of cosmopolitan mercantilism, and its influence radiates in multiple directions, north to St. Louis, west to Indian Country, south to New Orleans, and east to Kaskaskia and other American towns. St. Genevieve may be described as the breadbasket for St. Louis, but the town also provides more avenues for understanding a cosmopolitan and urban history of the Missouri borderlands. As J. Gitlin told me in private correspondence, the Osage are proud that St. Louis is their city, that they helped the French settlers build this economic center, and that they deserve as much credit as Laclede and Chouteau. And perhaps St. Genevieve should be similarly re-examined. Thank you. I said thank you. I also included a slide of some French-based sources for any genealogists or anybody who's curious. Louisiana Historical Center's project is great. The ones that are in purple, like the Archives Nationales and Gallica, these are French websites, but they do have English translations for them. The red ones, such as the Archives Nationales and the Parisian archives, are only in French, but they do offer digitized documents from this area and Louisiana. In case anybody's interested, I also use a GeneNet, which is like more for French stuff. But if you look up, let's say like David Delaunay, you'll get like a million of them. But it'll like give you like a little card, and it'll be like, it'll tell you like David Delaunay, and it'll say like where the document is from. And if you're not willing to pay for the premium of GeneNet, you can normally copy what the document is and then just Google it and find it on like the Internet Archive or Google Books. So there's ways to get around the paywall if anybody's curious in genealogical work. Yes.
In your research, you might find it interesting, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but 100 years earlier, in 1725, a delegation from the Illinois country went over. If I remember right, Osage were invited, and did they go or not go?
They did. So that's
and Bourgeois was the one who was working with them.
Yes, and that's Little Chief, the chief of the Little Osage, his great-grandfather. So he explicitly says he wants to go to France because his great-grandfather had gone to France, and he had heard stories about France.
Yeah.
So.
As you were thinking, I was trying to remember in the French newspaper, once I got that translated, how they were received versus how these, some similarities very much so, and being exotic and all these kind of things.
I can't remember if you gave dates or maybe I missed them, but how long were the Osage in France, like that whole time period you were talking about?
So they were in France from 1827 till 1830-ish. So it's only 3 years, but a lot happened in those 3 years. And it's one of those where like it really peaks in 1827, where like it's like non-stop newspaper article, newspaper article, newspaper article. And then after Delaunay's in prison, it like drops off really quickly of like, where are they at? What are they doing? And it's kind of like fads today. You know, that goes through really quick where like French people are obsessed and they're kind of like, oh, yeah, la boo boo, I guess so.
Let's give the winner.
Thank you very much for a wonderful day. It's nice to see that we have young people embracing history and using some of the new tools that have become available to us. When I look back at the first conferences that St. Genevieve had in 1983, most of this stuff in archaeology, the new tools, and being able to look at records across the world just didn't exist. And it's going to open up so much new research. I commented to somebody earlier, AI can be such a useful tool. Somebody talked about Jacques Bourd. He actually lived in Philadelphia after Saint-Domingue. I knew that, but I found through AI that he's had property there. Who would look for property and where to find it? And it was in a township south of Philadelphia. But he bought it from a guy named Charles Gregoire, who ended up building the house right next to his here. And he sold it to a guy named Francois Badeau, who was in Saint-Domingue and who moved here and died here. It's so hard to find all this new stuff, or stuff that's out there, but AI is opening up, find newspaper articles that you didn't even know existed. So it's wonderful stuff. I'm really glad. I appreciate you coming, Abigail and Rebecca, to talk with us. I think that's great for our future. So I'd like to have, let's see, Bill, why don't you come up and do a quick closure, followed by Misty.
Once again, thank you very much for coming today. I just wanted to touch base with you on a few of you do have a little card inside your packet that talks a little bit about our events. In addition to our events, the foundation also has the Mecca Research Library for French colonial studies here in town. We also, in conjunction with the city of St. Genevieve, manage and take care of the Memorial Cemetery, the oldest cemetery west of the Mississippi, European cemetery west of the Mississippi. And I also want to thank my friends from Les Amis who are here today, who gave us a generous grant to do some restoration in the cemetery recently. But I also wanted to talk just a little bit about our activities. In February, we sponsor the King's Ball, a celebration that's happened here for over 250 years in St. Genevieve, centered around the 12th night, a celebration of music and dancing with lots of costumed guests. We sponsored the Living in St. Genevieve house tour in the spring. We sponsored the French Heritage Festival in June, the Fall History Conference, obviously, today. We also sponsor a Deja Vu Spirit Reunion, which happens the last Saturday in the fourth, not the last, but the fourth Saturday in October, where costumed reenactors portray people who are buried in the cemetery. We also have a Christmas open house at the Keyboard Valet House and a holiday house tour in December, as well as a winter soiree in December. We are all about partnerships and collaboration. In the past few years, we have partnered with St. Genevieve Heritage Tourism with our French Heritage Festival and our King's Ball. We obviously collaborated today and quite happily with the Center for French Colonial Studies in the production of our history conference. And we want to collaborate with you. You'll also find in your packets membership forms for both the Center for French Colonial Studies and St. Genevieve, the Foundation for the Restoration of St. Genevieve. This way we can keep in touch with you. You can also keep in touch with us through our website, historicstgenevieve.org, and you can also Google Historic St. Genevieve for our Facebook page. So again, I thank you so much for coming. I hope I see many of you at tonight's banquet and at subsequent events such as this, our annual history conference. Thank you.
So I also want to thank you all for coming, making this a wonderful conference. We have, in the last couple of years, had a number of members and people who have been members either of the Center for French Colonial Studies or the Foundation or both. Also the French Canadian Heritage Society of Michigan. And some of them, like Brian Lee Dunnigan, he had contributed to Le Journal and I think probably had been a speaker for us. So we've had a number of people, as you can see here, we had 5 that have passed in the last couple of years, and just wanted to, memorialize them for a minute here. David McDonald was actually going to speak at this conference and had agreed to do so. You might have noticed in Rebecca's presentation that he wrote one of those books she had up on the slides about Kaskaskia, and he's no longer with us now. So just a number of people who have passed: Suzanne Somerville, Diane Shepard, Frank Nichols, David McDonald, and Brian Lee Dunnigan that we just wanted to bring to your attention in case you didn't know, and if you did and you knew them, to let you know that we're with you and thinking about them. I want to thank Bob again and Christy for organizing the conference. There have been other people in both organizations that have helped too. I do want to mention Dr. Terry Martin, because he talked to Dr. Mark Wagner, who in turn pulled in Rebecca Ramey to give the presentation for us. So thank you, Terry, for helping with that too. What else? I really don't have a lot more to say other than the main conference. If you haven't seen the table at the back of the room yet, do visit that. For those of you who are going to the banquet tonight, Dr. Andrew Beaupre is going to give us more information about that. Do continue to look for information about that and all the upcoming Le Journal issues. And with that, I would just encourage you, what time do we have here?
3:56.
Okay. You get a 5-minute break, and then we're having the membership meeting. Don't run away, come back. Just, stretch, take 5 minutes. If you're not a member, again, you are welcome to join us for the membership meeting. And thank you. I'll see you in 5 minutes.